Today I will talk about the nature of populism in Iran. Given that the current Iranian state is run by the Islamists, I'm really talking about the nature of populism in the Islamic countries. And this can also include the Muslim Brotherhood with other forms of Islamism, even Salafists. Uh, the current ruling elite and political establishment in Iran is a product of 1979 term. The event is commonly referred to as a revolution or the 1979 revolution. However, we have to note that the term revolution is common and popularly used in its common and technical sense. Otherwise, no revolution would give birth to a theocratic establishment, as it is the case in Iran. As a matter of fact, Iran is currently the only theocracy alive in the world. Unsurprisingly, massive executions followed the coming to power of the Islamists in Iran. But also the current political scene in Iran is characterized by international sanctions, which were imposed on Iran as early as 1981. This long-term sanctions had, as you can imagine, severe impact on the Iranian society. It made it poorer than before. We are speaking about a society which 80% of the society shape the margin of the entire society. So have a big population of lower classes, people who are in poverty, and then now a small section of middle class, and then the very few ruling elites. And this is what would constitute the hierarchy of the Iranian society. Um, Also, speaking of sanctions, no other states which they are in neighboring here in the Middle East, no other state met a pleasant fate after they were they were dealt with by international sanctions. Iraq, Syria, Libya, to a different extent, Yemen, all of the societies, the fabric of the societies was destroyed by the sanctions and then military interventions which subsequently followed the sanctions destroyed the very notion of state in the societies. So one can imagine that nothing good is going to come out of this international sanctions, which are currently hunting here for over 4 decades. I also have to mention that there is a dynamic in the Iranian politics, and that also had different shake-up and form since 1979. The ruling elite in Iran are divided or can be identified as based on two major forces, which I can refer to as the fundamentalists and the reformists. The reformists are more tended toward liberal political and economic agenda, but both forces sharing Islamism as their main platform and ideology. Speaking of Islamism as an isolated form of conservatism and their populist discourse doesn't really make sense. So Islamism has to be compared with universal conservatism and the current far-right movement to to be understood as compared to what's happening globally. Accordingly, the ultimate form of political establishment which may come out and rise from universal or even Western far-right movements is fascism, as it used to be in Europe in the eras between 1920s and mid-1940s. So the real question here is what is the similarities and differences between Islamism and fascism, or even can we consider the Islamists as fascists? To answer the question, I have to say that there are similarities and there are differences. Both forces, fascism and Islamism, are product of an organic crisis of capital. different to online crisis of hegemony, as Gramsci would refer to, or even hegemony is a form of capitalism, or at a certain point, capitalism needs hegemony in both national and global. Um, so when things are good, when there are free trade for the accumulation of capital, um, when the whole process of accumulation of capital, accumulation of capital worldwide is going smooth, you wouldn't see uh, extreme forces such as both Islamism and fascism. Uh, Therefore, both are product of crisis. They both share the notion of authoritarianism. They both rule brutally with a limited amount of tolerance for others. Uh, Both are preferred by the capitalist elites to fulfill specific tasks, again, during the time of crisis, particularly to eliminate the leftists and the revolutionary forces. So both fascists and Islamists are to maintain the very system, the capitalist system, which is really in place in the last 500 years. They have no claim that they are going to alter this system. Well, these are similarities, but there are crucial differences that distinguish these two forces from one another. And my conclusion is Islam is honest fascist. So the differences, we have to note that fascism enjoys an economic perspective. So all fascists that we saw in Europe in the 20th century, they were all protectionists with incorporation or incorporating some element of Keynesian social welfare. While the Islamists don't have any uh, economic perspective, they can adopt any form of maybe capitalist recipes whatever protectionist recipes, but they themselves don't enjoy an economic perspective. Fascism is product of an organic movement. So at the time of crisis, the disadvantaged population, the middle class and the lower classes, those who lost jobs, those who can't function economically, um, those who impacted the most, if you like, they really marched behind the fascist discourse, fascist agendas, as it was the case in the 20th century again. While the Islamists, they don't enjoy an organic movement. Throughout their brief history in early 20th century, when global crisis led to the First World War, then again in the 70s and 80s, we saw another rise of a new wave of Islamism, mainly against the Soviet Union. And even the post-Cold War uh, crisis, particularly after the occupation of Iraq in 2003 onward, all this Islamists relied on state and intelligence support, and relying on social and massive support from their own societies. The last differences which fundamentally distinguish and differ the Islamist forces from the fascist forces um, is that the fascists do have this organic intelligentsia and they produce their own intellectual discourse. While again, the Islamists, they don't have a specific intellectual discourse. all what they can rely on is their rather narrow interpretation of Islam, which is based on interpretation of Quran and other sacred texts such as Hadith, for instance. This can be a form of theology, but certainly not a modern discourse which deal with any material condition within society. So given this profound differences, uh, there are similarities between the Islamists and the fascists, but I'm not convinced, or I don't think that the Islamists can be considered as fascists.